Okay, here we go. You've seen this cup before. This is the story of the coffee cup that lied. So, again, in the 90s somewhere, and I'm working at Nichols Research, and I was a newly minted manager. I was running a small group, and just a little bit before this, Nichols had hired a newly retired government guy who came in with promises of being able to just do a lot for us. And we learned a lot from this guy over the next year or two. I don't remember. The problem is that these weren't things we really wanted to learn. So here was one of the lessons that we learned. We had a guy come in for an interview, never heard of him before, never met him. So first he hired with this new manager his name was Pete. I won't give his last name because he might still be alive. But he interviewed with Pete first. Then he came down to my office and he sat there. And I talked to him about what we do, what I would have him doing if he were to be hired and to come on board. And then he started talking to me about his expertise in Kalman filters. Well, I was very impressed because Kalman filtering it's an important and very useful thing, but not to what we were doing. And people who do that sort of thing are in fairly high demand in very small niches in the defense industry. But every time I tried to take the conversation that way, he would try to bring it back around to Kalman filtering. Well, whatever. We did hire him, and he worked for me. He didn't do any Kalman filtering because we don't do that. And as it happens, he and I became best friends. And so one day I just asked him, I was like, why did you keep talking about Kalman filtering in that interview? We don't do Kalman filtering. He looked at me and said, Pete said you did. Said you did it all the time. In fact, he said it'd be worth hiring me just for the Kalman filtering expertise that I have. Well, that was a few years later, but it sums up exactly the issue we had with this guy, which is he wasn't really a liar. We're all convinced that he honestly could not tell the difference between the truth, the actual truth, and the story that he had told in his head that he wanted to be true. We don't think he could tell the difference. Because if you told him that you had experience in Kalman filtering, his brain would very quickly say, oh, Kalman filtering. We can use that for this and this and this and this. And then it was just about that long before he would convince himself that we did this all the time and we needed it. And that was kind of the experience we had for 2 years of trying to work for a guy without knowing what reality he was seeing at that moment. We called him the Jedi because he had this bizarre ability to say, You don't actually think that, you think this other thing. And he could convince people to believe the most bizarre things. And we're confident that one of the people he really could convince that bizarre things were true was himself, because he convinced himself that these strangest things were true. And we never could. You can't beat that, right? You can't beat crazy, because no matter what you complained to him about, he would think up an immediate response to that, and whatever the response was in his head instantly became true. And so he believed, honestly believed, that whatever he had decided would be the way to solve the problem, he had already done, and so your problems were over. It was a really weird experience. So that's the coffee cup that lied.